This week we're looking at the story of the prophet Elijah. Why am I sitting in the dark? I'll tell you a story. Elijah is one of the great prophets. He is well revered in a lot of other religions besides Christianity. And Elijah is probably because he is one serious heavyweight prophet. He first comes on the scene when Ahab has married Jezebel, and Jezebel gets all her favourite religious people in. These are the prophets of Baal and Asherah. It's quite scary if you read about what those religions actually were. And Ahab is recorded in the book of Kings. You'll find him in 1 Kings 16 onwards. He is described as doing more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did any of the kings before him. So Ahab was really trying it on very, very hard to irritate as much as he could the God of Israel. And up pops Elijah. And Elijah's first point is he turns around to Ahab and basically says, the way you are behaving, there is going to be a drought brought on this land because of it for a few years. And God immediately turns around to Elijah and says, you've got to get out of here. So Elijah disappears off to a ravine on his own where there's a small stream, and he gets fed by ravens of all things. Now, if you know the imagery of the scriptures, blackbirds like ravens and rooks and things like that all have different messages. And of course, it was a raven that was set off first from the ark, because a raven can survive in anything. And that's what Elijah was doing. But the drought was so severe that even then he had to move on. He ended up with a widow at Zarephath, which is in a place called Sidon. And this is well outside Israel by now. He is really off his turf. And this lady is about to cook the last meal for her and her son. And the prophet has the neck to go up to her and go, well, before you do that, cook me one. And then I promise that what's going to happen is you will never run out of flour and oil. And during the drought, that's what happened. And the widow and her son survived. And this shows to some extent sometimes the gratitude we sometimes have in these things. Her son dies. And she blames Elijah, despite the fact that a few years before that, she was about to die from starvation, and her son was about to die from starvation. She still has the neck to blame Elijah. Anyway, Elijah prays for the son, and the son is resurrected. In fact, it's the first resurrection mentioned in the Bible. He then bumps into Obadiah because God has told him to go and have a word on Ahab again. And this is where it starts getting a bit more famous. Now, the first thing I wanted to mention, though, is Obadiah was in charge of the palace. If you want to put it in modern terms, if you're working in a business, Obadiah was the COO of Ahab, or the Grand Vizier, and there's various other terms, or the company secretary even. But he was also a very devout believer. And it just goes to show that even if we believe that whatever is going on is wrong, and there's moral questions around some of the things that go on, you may find Christians in the middle of it, doing their best because God's put them there. So don't necessarily question the people. It would have been very easy to say, well, Obadiah is Ahab's man, so he can't obviously believe in God. Well, he did. And he actually records that he had actually found 100 prophets that still hadn't bowed their knees to Baal or Asherah, and he had actually made sure that they were safe. He'd put them up in caves where he had fed them and watered them and made sure they were safe from Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel was absolutely determined she was going to destroy any belief in the God of Israel. Anyway, Obadiah is given a message by Ezekiel, and this is to really test Obadiah because he knows that if he comes out from behind the woodwork, he's going to become a target. And Obadiah is actually prepared to do what needs to be done for God's kingdom, and tells Ahab the message that was given, which is, meet me at Mount Carmel with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asher. Asherah. These are the prophets that Jezebel had brought into the country. Anyway, they all rock up. They have 2 bulls. They set 2 altars. And in the interests of fairness, because Baal is also the god of thunder and lightning and fire, Elijah says, you lot can go first. And they prepare the bull for the sacrifice. They put him on the wood, but they don't light the match. They have to pray to Baal to get the match, and it never happens. And of course, if you remember the story, what then happens is that Elijah then says, right, get me 4 large jars of water. So he does. They do. He sets up his altar, puts the beef on top of it, puts the wood on, then the beef, then soaks it with these 4 jars of water. He then tells them go and fill those jars up again and do it again, and then does it again a 3rd time. So 12 large jars worth of water are on this wood. It is absolutely sodden. And he gets down on his knees and he says, God, show them who's boss. And essentially ends up with charcoal beef. The whole thing is absolutely consumed to the point where the heat is so intense that the rocks that make up the altar are cracking. He then turns around to the Israelites who have been watching this, have been entertained all day by the behaviour of the Baal prophets, and says they're all false prophets, and all 850 of them are taken away and slaughtered by the Israelis. Now, considering, let's just think about it, these are Jezebel's people. Jezebel is absolutely furious about that. And we'll circle round to that, and also why I'm in the dark, in a minute. So just to carry on the story of Elijah, he then gets down on his knees and he prays. This is the bit where you really, really know that you've got to pray and you've got to keep pushing through, because he prays for rain, and each time he's praying, he turns around to his assistant and says, can you go and check what's happening over the side? And the assistant comes running back and says, I can't see a thing. And that happens 7 times. And on the 7th time, his assistant comes back and says, I can see a cloud in the distance the size of a fist. And that's the moment Elijah goes, run! And they run like crazy, because very soon, the whole of Israel is covered in a deluge, and the drought finally breaks. I'm just going to jump ahead now. I'm going to come back round to that in a minute. Elijah also appears in the story of Naboth's vineyard. And this again shows the nature of Ahab and Jezebel, but it's an interesting twist to the life of Ahab. Ahab really, really liked this vineyard. It belonged to Naboth, and he even went to Naboth and said, will you sell it to me? And Naboth said, no, I won't sell it to you. It's my family's, it's our inheritance. I don't want to sell it. So Jezebel comes up with this cunning plan where effectively she arranged for a big feast, and she's got 2 people there on either side of Naboth who then go ahead and accuse him of being a traitor. They basically bring false charges against him, wind up the mob, they take Naboth out and they stone him to death. And then Jezebel, as if she's done absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever, turns around to Ahab and says, get up and claim the vineyard. So he does, and he's walking around the vineyard. I think this is a really nice vineyard. When who comes around the corner? But Elijah. And Elijah says, I know what you've done. And he says, God's not going to treat you well on this. He's going to really, really, really have issues with this. And he's going to destroy you and your family. And those who die in the cities will be eaten up by dogs, and those who actually flee to the country will be eaten up by birds. And he also says Jezebel is going to die and be eaten by dogs at the place where Naboth was stoned. And if you read on, that's exactly what happens. They kill her, they throw her out the window, they have a bit of a feast afterwards, go down to tidy up the body and discover nothing is left because the dogs have eaten it all. That's the end of Jezebel. Not pleasant. That's what happens. Ahab at this moment, though, when he hears the prophecy, now this is the man that's been on the top of Mount Carmel. He's seen the power of God. And he knows that Elijah doesn't mess about. So he gets on his knees and he repents. He begs for mercy. And God says, right, well, okay, there's repentance here. And there's a thought there that actually, even though Ahab had been he'd done everything to really provoke God, there's still a forgiveness in God, which says, it doesn't matter how much we've done at times, God will still forgive us. But we've got to want to be forgiven. And Ahab really wants to be forgiven. And Elijah says this, he says, because you are repentant, because you want, you are absolutely remorseful about what has happened, you will actually not be part of this prophecy. You will live to a ripe old age. Cut a long story short, he dies in battle. And he leaves his son Azariah to take over. Now, Azariah, it's always a bit of an intriguing praise. He's described as having fallen through a lattice, and in the process hurts himself badly, ends up being bedbound, and he thinks, I need to find out what's going on here. I'm king, so I'll send some guys off to get a prophet of Baal from Tyre and Sidon, in other words, outside Israel, and see what's going to go on. Well, this messenger doesn't get very far. Who does he bump into? Elijah. Elijah says to him, go back, tell Azariah, is he going outside the country because he doesn't believe there's any skills in this country, that God is not in Israel? Anyway, Azariah is a bit miffed. He summons one of the captains of his army, and the captain and 50 men go down and demand that Elijah comes to see Azariah. The response to that is fire from heaven comes down and consumes them all. Azariah sends another 50 and a captain, and again the captain demands Elijah comes with him, and the same happens again. Azariah sends a third set, and the captain comes up to Elijah and goes, look, I know what happened to the last two. Can you not wipe out my men? Would you really mind awfully coming along with me? And Elijah says, yeah, okay. So he comes along, and the prophecy he gives over Azariah is this. Very simple. Because you have acted as if there is no king in Israel, you will not ever get out your bed. And Azariah dies in his bed from the wounds from falling through a lattice. We then jump on ahead, and then the next story comes to be to do with the golden chariot. And I don't know if you know the golden chariot story. Essentially, Elisha, who's now Elijah's apprentice, is told that Elijah is going to be taken away by God in a whirlwind. Elijah says, well, I'm going with him. Elijah says, I'm not leaving him. Elijah says, when they're in Gilgal, look, you just wait here. You just stay here. I'm off. You know what's going to happen. Elijah says, no, I'm coming with you. Gets to Bethel. Elijah's even approached by prophets at Bethel, so you do know what's going to happen. And Elisha says, I don't care. I'm still going with Elijah. I won't leave him. So they carry on to Jericho, where again another bunch of prophets come forward, tell the exact same thing. And Elisha says, no, I'm going with him. I'm going with him. So anyway, Elijah and 50 prophets go down to the edge of the river. 50 prophets stay back and watch. Well, Elijah comes forward, smacks the river with his cloak, river parts. The two of them walk into the desert on the other side. And then out of the heavens comes this mighty great big torrent of wind, and the golden chariot comes down, chariot of fire, and takes up Elijah into heaven. And all that's left is his cloak. And Elisha picks up the cloak, walks back to the river, smacks the river with the cloak. The river splits in half again, and he walks across a dry line back to the 50 prophets. And that is the story of Elijah, except for the bit I've missed. There is a little bit of an addendum. There's a bit of a follow-up. Elijah does appear with Jesus and Moses at the Mount of Transfiguration. And the prophecy is that Elijah will come before the Messiah, will reappear before the Messiah. And John the Baptist is actually challenged on that. And John says, no, I'm not him. But the prophecy that Zechariah, John's dad, got was that John would have the spirit of Elijah. So let's skip back to the bit that I missed and why I'm sitting in the dark. If you just remember, the heavens have opened. It's absolutely sodden. The place is, the heaven, you know what it's like. We've just had it the last couple of days. It's just rained and rained and rained. And Elijah is running. But worse than that, Elijah gets wind of the fact that Jezebel, absolutely furious that all her prophets, had been murdered by the Israelis because they had failed to get their sacrifice to burn up. She says, I am going to kill Elijah, no matter what it takes. Now, this is a very, very clever and scheming woman. I mean, she's basically got alongside Ahab. She has taken over Israel in such a way that she's tried to wipe out their own religion. She has tried to push God out of Israel, as if no God exists in Israel. She has actually persecuted the prophets of God. She has, later on, as we discovered, she's not adverse to setting people up to be murdered so that you can actually get their property, nick their property, confiscate it, whatever you want to call it. She's not pleasant, and she is absolutely determined she is going to kill Elijah. Now this, as I said before, is a prophet who has got boots on. Elijah is a prophet you don't mess around with. Elijah's the sort of guy that will live in a desert being fed by ravens. He's the sort of guy that will take on 850 prophets from false gods. He's prepared to stand up for God. And yet Jezebel has said, I'm going to have his neck. And he runs. And he panics and he panics and he runs. The whole thing, his world is collapsing around him. He doesn't know what to do. He's in a panic. So he runs south and he gets as far as Beersheba. And when he gets there, he turns around to his assistant, the one that went to go off and see the cloud, says, you stay here. You stay here. Don't come with me. Don't go with me. And he runs another day out into the desert where he collapses. He's seriously dehydrated. He's seriously hungry. And he prays to God, take my life. When you get really depressed, sometimes that's the only way you think is the way out. Take my life. What he got instead was an angel turning up with food and water. So God attended to Elijah's immediate needs. When people are in mental health crises, often we all sort of think of the highfalutin. Sometimes what's actually needed, the first step, is just a calming ear, a cup of tea, a piece of cake, just to calm things down, just to help things out, just to reinforce. God addresses Elijah's immediate needs with food and water. Elijah gets up and carries on. And he ends up at Mount Horeb, which is the other half of Mount Sinai. If you remember, that's where the laws came from. And God basically says, well, what are you looking for? And Elijah goes up into the mountain, into a cave. That's why I'm here in the dark. And he says to God, I'm the only one left in Israel that follows you. God said, just you wait, and I'll meet you here. And he's in the cave, and outside there's an almighty wind, and the rocks are being blown around the place, and scrubs are being pulled out, trees are falling down. Then there's an earthquake, and rocks are being cracked in half, and the ground is shaking, and he's hiding in this cave as everything seems to be falling around him. And then there's a mighty fire sweeps across the side of the mountain. And then there's a still small voice. And at that moment, Elijah wraps his cloak around his head and walks out to face God. Man to God, God to man. And he says the exact same thing to God again. I am the only man left that follows you. And God goes, actually, that's not the case. He says, there's at least 7,000 people in Israel who have never kneeled to Baal and never kissed Baal. You're not on your own, mate. Have you ever thought about that sometimes as a Christian in our Western society? We read in the press of churches tearing each other apart over things that, to be perfectly honest, they're minor, inconsequential at the edges of the church. They forget about loving each other. They forget about being there for each other. And the Western secular world loves to stir things up, loves to put the boot in to suggest that we're evil, that we're wrong, that we're on the wrong side of history. That's a phrase that I've heard a lot these days. And people within our own church sometimes believe that and will follow that and will be concerned about the things that they said. And yet there is a core in this country that still firmly believe in their hearts that when they say that commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, they really know what that means, that they love God with all their heart and all their soul and all their strength. The remnant is still there. And we should never forget that even if we are in a country where the church seems to be under persecution, the churches seem to be closing, that people are not turning up anymore, that the young generation don't seem to know God and don't seem to be interested in God, we need to remember that the number of people who would identify as Christian in the world is over 1/3 of the world's population. It is the largest religious group, faith group, whatever you want to call it, of any of the major philosophies or religions or faiths in this world. We are more than conquerors. And Elijah had to be reminded of that. He was not the only man. He was not the only one left. There were 7,000 others. And this is very strange for a man who had already met Obadiah, and Obadiah had told him that there was at least 100 that Obadiah was looking after. Sometimes we don't like to hear the good news when we're right down and depressed. So Elijah had his food, water. He'd been taken to a place where he'd actually essentially had what might be best described as a form of behavioural therapy that involved earthquakes, wind, fire. And yet it's that still small voice. The reality check, sometimes called it, when somebody goes, is this really as bad as you think? Is this you on your own? Ultimately, it's about prayer. This whole story, Elijah's whole life was about prayer. He spent time in praying, building his relationship with God. Prayer doesn't mean necessarily going off into a cave on your own, though you can do that. It can also be when you're driving. Don't close your eyes when you're driving. Pray when you drive. Just a tip. It can be anywhere. It can be when you walk the dog. It can be that moment in the evening. It can be in the business of the day when the office is going mental or the shop is going mental. You take 5 minutes out. It can be the moment when you sit down to break bread together as a family, when the food is on the table and you bless, you call a blessing upon yourself, you say a grace over the food and ask for it to bless you and your family, and ask God to bless you and your family through the provision of the table, and thank him for having food on the table. So Elijah stood there with his cloak over his head and the still small voice. And then God says, I've got a job for you, mate. I need you to go and anoint 3 people. The first is Hazael, the king of Aram. Aram was at war with Israel. That is a bit like somebody turning around to someone in Ukraine and saying, go and bless Putin, right? That's the sort of thing he's been asked to do. And then the second one he's asked to do is to go and anoint Jehu. That's a bit better. Jehu's going to be the king in Israel. There's a couple of kings to go before that. You've got Jeroboam, anyway. Jehu becomes the king. And the people that have stood against God and have denied God's existence in Israel die by their own choice through the attack and the assault of Aram. And those who haven't end up dying of the sword by Jehu. And God is brought back into Israel through sheer pain and bloodshed. And you circle right back to Omri, Ahab's dad, Ahab himself, and Azariah, and everything that has gone on in Israel to deny God's existence. And it has come back to haunt people, to kill people. When you turn your back on God, it's not God that destroys you, it's you destroying yourself. And the third person, who's the most interesting of the one lot, we've already heard about him, is Elisha. Elisha, he's told to go and anoint Elisha. Now, I like Elisha because he was bald. So, good man. He heads off, and the first of the three he bumps into is Elisha. And Elisha is ploughing. Now, you normally see a picture of people ploughing with horses or oxen, and there's one yoke or two pulling the plough. Well, I mean, there's two oxen or two horses and one yoke. Elisha is actually ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen. That is 24 oxen. That must have been a mighty big plough. That is one serious amount of weight pulling it. And to manage and control that, you have to be one serious bloke. You're going to have to be ripped to manage something like that. But then, having said that, Elijah was obviously a farmer's son. And when you see some of the shape and size of some of the farmer's sons, you probably understand why. He was built of very firm stuff. And Elisha does a very interesting thing. He doesn't immediately follow Elijah. What he does do is he takes the 24 oxen and all the ploughing gear, and he builds a pyre using the ploughing gear, and he sacrifices all 24 oxen and then follows Elijah. In other words, he sacrifices everything to God and then follows God's calling. Sold everything up. Modern agricultural terms, he's gone and torched the big tractor and the 8-footer reversible, or the 24-footer reversible, whatever they use nowadays. I mean, the sizes are getting huge. And he's prepared to follow Elijah. And that's the man that gets the cloak, that hits the river, and walks across some dry ground. So, Elijah, he's no spring chicken, he's no mealy-mouthed, nicey person. He's very determined that he knows God and he knows God's will. And then when he really is at the bottom of the bottom, at the lowest of the low, God helps him. And God helps him in a very, very strong and positive way. And Elijah walks out of that cave and listens to the small voice and goes on to continue to be God's prophet in Israel, despite the amount of persecution that was coming against the God of Israel, our God. He carried on, and he carried on to the end. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this wasn't too dark or too grim. If you want to read more, go away and read in 1 Kings 16 onwards, and then the finish at the end of the stories in 2 Kings. Great, exciting, and in fact, actually, to be perfectly honest, you crack on and read about Elisha too. He was some guy as well. Farmer's son, bald. I can relate. So in your small groups, ask yourself some questions about this. Elijah's life, what does this tell us about God? With the behaviour of the Israelis and Jezebel and the prophets, what does this tell us about humankind? What does it tell us about civil society? If this has spoken to you, what are you going to change in your life? And who are you going to tell about it? Finally, just remember that hymn. Through earthquake, wind and fire, the still, small voice of calm. Thank you.